So it's my pleasure to have Professor Sheri Berman. Thank you so much for joining me. And we'll move straight forward to our first question, which is related to the seminar you presented before. And those who missed it, please go and take a look at the video on YouTube. Can you please summarize your research findings related to populism for a layman?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me. So I've done a lot of work on populism with a particular emphasis on the relationship between the rise of the populist right in Europe and the United States and the decline of mainstream parties, particularly those of the center left. And there's a lot of reasons for this. The most obvious one is that a generation ago, a lot of the folks who are now voting for populist right parties, low educated, low income voters, would have been the natural constituencies for labor parties, social democratic parties, and socialist parties. So that's a generational shift. It hasn't happened over the course of an election or two, but it is an important demographic and political change. And I don't think that those things are coincidental. I think that a lot of the support for populism comes from frustration with the status quo, economic frustration, discontent or concern about social and demographic changes in society. And historically, parties of the left have been those that have very much worked to integrate, as I mentioned, low income and low educated voters into democracy. That is to say, to anchor them in the democratic system, to provide policies for them that would make them feel they had a stake in that system, that that system was working for them. And I think their declining ability to do that during the late 20th century helps to explain the alienation that many of these folks felt, not only from those parties, but from democracy more general, and made them kind of ripe for the picking, so to speak, for the populist right, which obviously thrives on and accelerates, deepens dissatisfaction with the establishment and democracy. So that's really what my research is focused on, the relationship between the decline of the left and the rise of the populist right.
Okay, thank you. And relatedly, if we should worry about these trends, what are the possible ways to fight or to reduce populism, in your opinion?
So that's a great question, and obviously a very big one. I mean, on the most basic level, populists and all radical parties, right? It doesn't matter of what type, and they can be on the left as well as the right, obviously thrive on dissatisfaction. It's a kind of obvious thing to say, but an important thing to say nonetheless, which is that if people believe that democracy is working for them, that it is solving their problems and the problems of society, there won't be any market, so to speak. There won't be any demand, rather, for radical parties. So once we kind of recognize that truism, some logical things follow from that. Most obviously, again, that populism is partially, largely, I would say, actually a consequence, as I've already mentioned, of dissatisfaction with the establishment, with mainstream political parties in particular. And so, one thing to note is that if we want the dissatisfaction that populism thrives on to go away, the parties, mainstream parties, the quote unquote establishment, both in the political sphere and within civil society, has to do a better job of dealing with the challenges that citizens and societies face. So in the parts of the world that I know best, the United States and Europe, those are economic challenges, rising inequality, rising insecurity, growing divides between successful urban areas and left behind rural ones. And there are also social challenges, right? These societies, particularly in Europe, have changed dramatically over the past decades. They have become much more diverse as far as people's backgrounds is concerned, as far as people's lifestyles are concerned. And while I think most of the folks who are listening to this kind of podcast think that is a positive thing, and indeed it is really very important that parties help people to adjust. It's easy for folks with a lot of education who travel around the globe who speak many languages to accept, embrace, and benefit from that kind of diversity. But for people who don't have that kind of background, those kinds of social changes can be just as disconcerting as the economic ones that we more easily recognize and want to deal with. So I think it's really important as societies changed for politicians, for parties, for civil society organizations to figure out ways to make those changes less disruptive for citizens already there. That means better policies on integration. That means better policies on assimilation. That means making sure that when you accept all of these new folks into your society, that you have programs, institutions, etc., prepared to help them adjust and also to help existing citizens adjust. So, to answer your question, to circle right back to your question, is the best way to deal with populism, the best way to deal with radical parties is by not allowing the kinds of dissatisfactions that they thrive on to develop or expand in the first place.
That's very interesting. So do I understand you correctly? What you are basically saying that if there is a very equal society or very thriving society, there will be way less populism in such society. So for example, we should expect way less populism in, let's say, I'm just throwing it, Monaco than in third world countries.
Well, it's I would say societies that are economically and socially stable will not have demand for radical parties. Now, that stability is relative, right? So, I mean, our societies in the, in Western Europe in particular, and in the United States, we are by all objective standards incredibly well off in any variety of ways. I think what really makes life difficult, alongside obvious crises, Great Depressions, things like that, is unanticipated changes that are not matched by institutions and other kinds of whatever procedures and programs that can help people adjust to those kinds of changes. So I think it's sort of, if you imagine an analogy to biology, right? Someone who has a very, who's very healthy, who has a highly functioning immune system, can walk through a room full of germs, let's say, and be totally fine, right? Someone else who has a compromised immune system will walk through that very same room and get potentially very ill. It's not the objective challenges only that matter, right? They do, right? There are obviously some periods that are more difficult than others, but it's the body, either the individual's body or the political body's ability to deal with those kinds of challenges that matters as well. So it's a question of kind of matching the sort of objective circumstances, the things that are out there, the way the world is, right? And a society or a polity's ability to deal with those kinds of challenges, right? You have to look at both sides of the equation if you want to understand if there are going to be problems, dissatisfaction, etc.
Thank you, and I completely agree with you. It's so ironical because we are better well off than any other point in time, and still, as you say, it's all relative to what we compare. And what do you think? Does information abundance help reduce populism? Like, for example, because of accountability, or it's the other way around because it's easier to spread misinformation and stuff like that?
I think the answer to that is yes, which is to say, I think both of those things are going on. So, over the last decades, the time when, we've seen rising populism, we've had this incredible shift in communications technologies. And that shift has had profound consequences that are continuing to play themselves out. So on the positive side, we just have much more access to information and more diverse sources of information than we had 25 years ago, right? And so for some people, that has been an incredible boon. It enables them to hold politicians accountable, to learn about things that they would not have had the opportunity to learn about before, and to learn about different ways of thinking about things that they would not have had the opportunity to learn before. All of those things are positive in general and certainly positive for democracy. On the other hand, it is also given non-mainstream politicians, parties, and other kinds of figures new ways to spread whatever you want to call it, fake news, propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, and to reach people who they might not have been able to easily reach before because the establishment and the nature of communication technologies had a much greater filtering role 25 or 30 years ago than it does today. So, I mean, we are living in an era of, really important technological change in communications and other things. And these things have the potential both to help democracy, as you said, to kind of inform people, to hold people accountable. It's much harder to hide things than it was in the past. We find out about all kinds of scandals, misuse of funds, people's private lives that we would never have been able to find out about before. But at the same time, it has really allowed people who would not have been able to get a hearing so easily to get one. For people who have like-minded radical views to find each other, and for people, again, who want to spread fake news, misinformation, disinformation to do so. So I think both of those things are going on at the same time. There are both advantages and disadvantages as far as democracy is concerned to changing communications technologies.
I see. And again, going relatedly to this question, what do you think? Do we have to be afraid of the populistic talk because it is related to action, or there is a correlation to action, or it's just populistic talks, which is usually a cheap talk, and people and the politicians don't take action on what they say?
So that's also a great question. I would say, to sort of go back to the analogy I talked about before, one of the things that characterizes populist politicians, so as a sort of definitional point, is a particular type of talk, right? A real, not just dissatisfaction with some of the things the establishment has done, particular policies, particular priorities, but a sort of insistence that that entire establishment is corrupt, working against the people, yada, 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 an insistence that they actually represent the silent majority of people, and everybody who opposes them is somehow evil. This talk is indeed antithetical to democratic norms, right? You can't see your opponent as your enemy. Your opponent is someone who differs from you, perhaps in very important ways, but it's not your enemy. You have to be able to compromise. You have to be able to lose elections. You have to be able to lose fights, all of these kinds of things. But the question of how dangerous that talk is not just cannot just be assessed by listening to that talk, right? But if we want to understand what the consequences of that talk is, again, it depends on the strength of the society and polity in which that talk is going on, right? So if you are in a democracy that has strong institutions and strong norms, right, people who get up and say these kinds of really problematic, illiberal, anti-democratic things will not be able to get all that much done, right? But if you are living in a polity, in a society that are characterized by serious divides, by weak institutions, by crumbling norms, then that kind of talk can have much more serious consequences. So it is absolutely important to pay attention to what people say, because at the very least, it gives you some insight into what they might want to do, into what their behavior would be if they got to power. But really important, again, is also thinking about the context within which they find themselves. If I might, throw out another analogy, it is admittedly an extreme one, but it's one that I use with my students all the time. If Vladimir Lenin had been born in the United States rather than Russia, exact same ideas, exact same personality, nobody would have known who he was, because those ideas, that personality would not have found a context within which it could flourish, where it could gain adherence, where it would face a regime that was weak enough to be toppled, right? So, the fact that there are extremists, all around is important to note, because an individual can, if determined, create a lot of damage. But how much damage, what the consequence of those individuals' beliefs and preferences are, will also depend, as I said, by the context within which he or she finds herself.
That's a very interesting analogy, especially for someone who is coming from the USSR or born in USSR. And another question, if populists claim that they fight for the people, why politicians try to avoid this title?
Mhm. So, of course, all politicians claim that they're trying to help the people, their voters, but the people more generally. Nobody says, I'm sort of in it to, promote the interests of an elite or a minority, or at least nobody says that openly today, particularly in the advanced industrial world, right? There's nothing wrong with saying you're trying to help your society or a majority of your people. The problem is when you oppose that idea of the people to something else that is not considered legitimate, is not considered, to be part of your citizenry, right? When you create divisions that go beyond, as I said, policy differences or differences in priorities, but to try to delegitimize those people who are objectively part of your society and who are citizens, but who just don't agree with you. So again, it's important here to listen to the language, right? All politicians claim to be working for the good of, again, the people, their voters, citizens more generally. The question is how they frame that and how they see not only the people who are supporting them, but the people who are not. Do you want to destroy them? Do you claim that they're evil? Do you claim that they do not legitimately have a right to participate, to protest, to criticize, yada, yada, yada? So, language matters here, and the way in which words and concepts are invoked really is it's important.
I see. And what is, in your opinion, the most pressing issue in the study of democracy, going from the topic of populism to a more broad question?
Right. So that's obviously a topic that's of concern not only to citizens but to political scientists and other social scientists today. I would say that we are confronting now, have been confronting for some years in many countries of the advanced industrial world, a growing dissatisfaction with democracy. There's always some people who are unhappy, but but there seems to have generally been, a shift in the zeitgeist, so to speak, from certainly the 1990s when there was a kind of triumphalist view that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. The view that democracy and capitalism had triumphed over its great enemy and was kind of going to go on, from triumph to triumph in the coming years. That sense of optimism and triumphalism really did not last for very long. Historically, someone was historically minded, they should have recognized that this is not the way history works. But in any case, what we're dealing with today is some genuine dissatisfaction with democracy. We have not had significant democratic backsliding in Western Europe. We have had some in Eastern Europe, although again, those are new democracies, countries that first regained their independence in 1989, so that a lot of these democracies turned out to be relatively weak and troubled is not, again, historically surprising, but certainly disappointing. We have not seen in countries with a relatively long history of democracy and highly developed economies, let me put it that way. We have seen some major dissatisfaction, but as of yet, no backsliding. That is to say, no shift from a democratic to an authoritarian or even, semi-authoritarian system. But that doesn't mean that dissatisfaction is not real and that there has not been significant decay. So the question is, or the challenge for political and social scientists is figuring out ways today, to get back to that original topic that we talked about, to deal with the major challenges that advanced industrial democracies face. And that is the challenges of how to recalibrate the economy so that its benefits are spread ever more widely, and to figure out ways to reconcile citizens to the growing diversity of their societies, which has incredible potential upsides, but thus far has not seemed to benefit all citizens. So those are the challenges that people who study, again, the advanced industrial world have to face or have to deal with. More generally, again, figuring out ways to strengthen democracy across the board in places where it is new and weak, but also in places, as I mentioned, where it has been in place for a very long time and where people have the benefits of not just that relatively long democratic history, but advanced economies that should be able to provide better for all citizens than they have over the past decades.
Okay, I hope we will figure out solutions to these really challenging problems and not go into problems. As Churchill, I think, said, democracy is, I don't remember exactly the quote,
Right.
but
The worst system except for all others. And I think
yes,
that
yes,
yes,
yeah,
like many of his sayings, was actually quite on target.
yes. And here is another probably tough question. What is, in your opinion, the most impressive finding from the last 10 years in political science?
That is a great question. What do I think is the most impressive finding? So let me say the most impressive finding perhaps is a finding actually that is not new, but has been rediscovered in a way, and I think relates to the question that we just previously discussed, which is there was a long-standing, sort of acceptance in political development studies, the study of, sort of democracies and dictatorships, that, you know, uh, advanced industrial economy, not just great wealth, but an advanced industrial economy was strongly correlated with successful democracy. And people debated the reasons for that, but that correlation seemed to hold. Over the past decades, as we've seen some democratic backsliding, that correlation has been questioned. People like, maybe it doesn't hold anymore. But in fact, now with some hindsight, we can see that that correlation remains and that there are important reasons for that. That is to say that even with all of the democratic dissatisfaction that we've seen, countries with high levels of wealth and diversity, that is to say not resource-based economies, have managed to generate societies that are relatively resilient democratically. So I would say that is a finding that's been sort of rediscovered and is important. Similarly, there was a sort of discussion some generations ago about the sort of social, not just the economic prerequisites of democracy. And there were arguments that scholars made about the kinds of social preconditions that were necessary for making democracy work. And I think one of the things that we have circled back around to is a recognition of not just the economic, but also those social prerequisites. In particular, the more rapidly societies are changing, the more important cross-cutting ties among citizens are. One of the things that we've recognized over the last several decades, again, I'm talking about Europe and the United States because those are the parts of the world I know best, is that citizens have become not only more economically divided, but more socially divided. We've had more homogenous communities, more homogenous neighborhoods, less social interaction among people of different political preferences and priorities, and that this is very, very dangerous, that citizens need to have cross-cutting ties in their everyday lives so that they can learn to accept difference, to become used to difference. And this is something, again, that I think was talked a lot about in a previous era when people worried about democracy after the interwar period in particular, but that we've rediscovered again, that there are these important social prerequisites and these cross-cutting ties at the level of civil society, at the level of everyday life, are really, really important.
Yes, and challenging. It's not easy to accept differences between people. So if I understand you correctly, you say to protect, to guard democracy, it's better to be rich as a country, at
It's
least
better
one
to
way.
be rich. It's better to be rich than poor. And it's better to have a society with a lot of cross-cutting ties than a society where people are living only around, interacting only, or primarily, shall I say, better to put, with people who share their political backgrounds, who share their political preferences. Creating a society of bubbles is very dangerous, or containerized is very dangerous for democracy.
I see. And as a very accomplished scholar, what is your advice to our younger listeners who are young scholars? What will you suggest them?
Well, I
As
mean, yeah, sorry.
no, go ahead.
From a professional perspective, again, I'm not as familiar with the academy in Israel as I am obviously with the academy in the United States or even Europe. I mean, from a professional perspective, it's important early in your career to get yourself involved in debates, in research agendas that will enable you to build networks and enable you to have important and interesting conversations about your research. So I think it is important to sort of figure out what the sort of cutting edge or most dynamic debates in your field are, and figure out how you can contribute to them, because that is the way that you build networks and you build your reputation. That does not mean, however, that you should simply do whatever seems to be sort of trendy in the field, because A, if you're not particularly interested in it, you're likely to produce rather boring research. And B, if you just stick with trends, not only are they likely to switch, but they're also likely to be filled with tons of other people doing the same thing. So I do think it's important early in your career to figure out how to embed yourself into networks and research agendas, but not simply to follow trends. And as you build those networks and as you build a reputation, it gives you more freedom to branch out, perhaps in ways that are slightly outside or orthogonal to existing debates. But it's really important, I think, to build a community of people who know you, who respect you, and who you can learn from early in your career.
Thanks. So basically, you're saying that networking is important not only in politics, but in science as well.
Perhaps, yeah.
And our final question for today, which book would you recommend us to read? I see that you have a great library behind you, so I'm sure you have many suggestions.
I do have a lot of suggestions, but I'm going to pick one since I have so many that I actually went over with my students in my class yesterday, since it's on my mind. And it's a classic. It's Eugene Weber's Peasants into Frenchmen. So there's tons of great books out there. This is an old one, and it's a classic. And having just, like I said, gone back to it yesterday with my students, I was struck, as I hadn't been in a while, on how great a book it is. Not only great because it was innovative and, sort of at the time sort of said something that people hadn't thought about before, that is to say how very difficult and how very late the nation building process was, even in a place like France, which we think of as a country that has existed forever with a national identity that has, sort of been there through the, sort of sands of time. That's simply not the case. And Weber did a great job of showing that. So I think it's a great book just because, again, it taught us something that people didn't know. But from a more general perspective, right, what it teaches us is that identities are not something that are given. They are something that, have an anchoring in some kind of objective reality, but do not come to fruition without significant effort on the part of the state, other elites, important civil society actors, and then identities are constantly contested and potentially in flux. And I think in an era when people are talking a lot about identity formation and the future of the nation state and what is and is not a nation state, Weber's book really reminds us that even those places that we take for granted, like France, should not be, in the sense that they were very much constructed and took a very, very long time, even, as the title of the book, Peasants into Frenchmen, reminds us, to turn people into individuals who thought of their identities first and foremost as French. This was not a natural process. It was a difficult process. It was a long-term process. And identities are always potentially open to contestation. So I will leave with an oldie but a goodie.
Sheri, thank you so much. I think it's a great summary of our talk today, so that we have to be on guard and protect the democracy, especially in tough times. Again, thank you for your time, and we hope to see you again in our seminar.
Thank you very much.